right, good morning, everybody. We're going to have to find a way someday to blow these pillars up. They do get in our way. But my name's Catherine Newman, and I am the provost of the University of California system. That word provost means nothing to people outside of the academy, but that's the chief academic officer for the university system. And on behalf of everyone in the president's office, I am delighted to welcome you all to the California Economic Futures Forum. We know people are going to be joining us throughout the day, both in these open sessions and in more, I guess, smaller groups and so on. But we're really thrilled to have you all here today as we do a deep dive into the critical issues that face the state and explore what is in store for California's future. We're very grateful to have this amazing space, the UC Student and Policy Center, as the host of this insightful conversation. It's a brand new facility that is intended to be the public face of the University of California to our colleagues here in Sacramento. It's a state-of-the-art center. It is a tangible embodiment of the university's commitment to integrating the power of teaching, research, and public service to achieve the primary goals that we have here: training future state leaders, addressing challenging public policy issues, and assisting state government with the extraordinary brain trust that is the University of California. And today's event is very much in keeping with that mission. You will hear from the state's top leaders in business, in local government, in the legislature, in the state administration, in the media and academia, as they dissect all of these complicated trends that are sculpting California's economic landscape. These conversations are going to offer insight into how everyone has a part in keeping key industries thriving here in California in the face of a great deal of economic and budgetary uncertainty. To kick things off, I'm really honored to introduce two of California's distinguished economists from UCLA, Jerry Nickelsburg and Ji-Yun Lee, who will present the 2024 UCLA Anderson Economic Forecast. The Anderson Forecast stands as one of the most respected and comprehensive forecasts for California's economy, and it provides a truly excellent foundation for the discussions ahead. So thank you again for being here today, and without any further delay, I pass the baton to Jerry.
Thank you, and welcome to those of you who got up early enough to be in person, and to those maybe still in their pajamas on Zoom. So today, in the time that we have allotted, we're going to talk about the U.S. economy and the California economy, and also my colleague Ji-Yun Lee is going to be talking about some new research that we're doing, which integrates climate change to our economic forecast. So before we get started on the U.S. forecast, the idea here is to do something different from what we've seen in other forecasts, in other forward-looking statements, and that is to incorporate year by year the way in which climate change is going to affect the economic outlook, because that, as opposed to in 2030 or 2035, climate change is going to do X, is going to give us a roadmap where we can get better policy. When do you implement policy to mitigate climate change effects on the state of California and the economic outcomes? And so that's something that's really unique. Ji-Yun's going to talk about where we are in this research. Is just beginning, but it's also very exciting. So let's turn to the U.S. forecast, and what you see on this slide are a couple of pictures, and I've entitled this a return to normalcy. And so, of course, I had to have Warren G. Harding, who in the last Roaring '20s, that was his slogan, a return to normalcy. But there's kind of an important point here, and that is that we don't want to conflate our understanding of data with what happened in that very weird time a couple of years ago, which was the pandemic. Rather, we want to compare it and learn from the changes that happened as a result of the pandemic, but normal times to normal times. So pre-2020 to what's going on today. And then the second picture that you see there is obviously gridlock. And any forecast by anyone has to make an assumption about what's going to happen in Washington, right? And they may not say it, but that assumption is going to be implicit in any forecast. And in ours, we assume that regardless of what happens in November, we have gridlock in Washington. That may be wrong, but that's the explicit assumption that we make. If we don't, if one party dominates what's happening in policymaking in Washington, or another party does, then our forecast is going to veer off of what you're going to see today in kind of the direction that you would expect. Okay, so let's jump in. Here's our roadmap. We're going to talk about the macro outlook and then interest-sensitive sectors, and then we're going to turn to the California outlook. So jumping right in on the macro outlook, what you see in this graph is the growth rate of U.S. GDP. And if you're looking kind of to the left of that vertical line, you see that it jumps way up to 4.8% and then to 3.4% in the last quarter. Tomorrow, we get the first quarter of 2024. We're sort of on the high end there at 2.2 in terms of economic forecast, but we're seeing a lot of indicators in strong employment growth, in durable goods orders. Just came out yesterday, second straight month of increasing durable goods orders. And so we're seeing a lot of strength in the economy, but weaker than those last two because in part inventories are not going to be growing as fast. But something I'd like to point out here, that those two big spikes, that 4.8 and 3.4, you remember back in 2022, we were going to have a recession, right? So if you read the East Coast newspapers, all economists said we were going to have a recession. Obviously, they were not looking at the Anderson forecast because we weren't saying that, because it wasn't in the data. And so first it was second quarter of 2022. Whoops, that didn't happen. Third quarter 2022. It's going to be in 2023. And I remember having a spirited conversation with two economists who were absolutely insistent that the third quarter of 2023 was going to be a recession. 4.8%, some recession, right? And I want to talk about kind of what happened, why we didn't see a recession where one might have happened with the increase in interest rates. So the unemployment rate today, 3.8%. We're still at full employment. And as I said, we've had good job growth. And so, our expectation is that inertia is just going to carry us through the year. In the forecast, we have a weaker next two quarters. And that's not because we're pushing towards a recession. When you think about capacity constraints, whether they're labor or physical capital, that's going to slow down growth. What you really want is full employment. So the only growth that you get is through productivity gains and through an expanding labor force. That means slower growth. So you can have slow growth and it's a good thing, or slow growth and it's a bad thing. In this case, it's a good thing. And then we go back to trend in our forecast. So now turning to inflation. And of course, you've heard a lot about inflation, and the Federal Reserve month after month after month said that they were going to keep increasing interest rates until the inflation rate was 2%. Right now, as you see here, we have two measures of inflation. One is core, that takes out the volatile food and energy. It's at 3.8% for March, 3.5% for total inflation. And our forecast is for it to come down in the 2.5 to 2.7 range. That's not 2%. But you're not hearing the Fed say, we've changed our mind. And you're not hearing them say that we're going to increase interest rates. On the contrary. So what's going on? Why is the Fed taking that position? And why are we saying that there are not going to be increases in interest rates in the federal funds rate, even though we don't have 2% inflation? So what I want to do is take these inflation metrics and break them down and show you why the Fed has not changed their mind, but looked at the data a little differently. The way in which these inflation metrics are constructed is the Bureau of Labor Statistics goes out to cities across the country, and they take a sample and get an average household budget. And then every month they go out and price that budget. And the month-to-month increase in inflation is the difference between the price this month and the price last month. Or the year over year, which is what these numbers are, is the price this month to the equivalent month a year ago. So that's the way they construct it. What I want to do is take that budget and just break it down and see what's driving the inflation rate. So that's going to be this diagram, and I need to explain it a little bit. Along the horizontal axis, those are all the elements in the household budget, right? That's that original household budget that they measured. And the vertical axis represents how much inflation there is. And the orange here is the, let's see, the orange is the contribution of each one of these items. And the blue adds up everything to the left of that. So we're accumulating the impact on inflation. And what you notice is we get all the way over here and we have almost no inflation. In fact, we're at or below that 2% target, except for something called other transportation and shelter. Now, other transportation you might think is, those airline tickets, but actually the airline ticket prices are going down. Other transportation is in the repair of automobiles and the insurance to cover it. And the reason why that is as high as it is that we're driving different cars today than we did 10 years ago, or even that we did a year ago, right? Our cars we have more electric cars, we have more driver assist, they're much more sophisticated than before, and they're very expensive to repair. And this other transportation does not include auto parts. Auto parts are not really going up. It's the labor. So just as an example, I had to replace a windshield, and the previous time that I had a rock hit my windshield and had to replace it, some guy came out to the house and popped one off, put a new one in, sealed it, and $350. I don't know if you all have had to replace a windshield anytime recently. It's over $2,000. And that's not because the sensors are expensive, they are, but it's because you need skilled labor to take those sensors off without damaging them. Then you pop the windshield in and seal it, and then you put those sensors back on, and then you have to calibrate them. Highly skilled labor, and it's expensive. And increases in interest rates is not going to change that. In fact, as our older cars are replaced by newer cars, the average cost to repair cars goes up just because of the composition effect. The second here is shelter. Shelter is the average rents that people pay. And rents, so it's not mortgages. If you have a mortgage, you're not in this, right? This is rents. And rents are paid on long-term contracts, right? Leases that go a year or two and the like. And also we have rent-stabilized units. When those leases come up or when rent-stabilized units are vacated, new rents are charged and they're new market rents. So that average goes up just as a function of the way the rental market works for shelter. Higher interest rates doesn't change that. So the Fed is looking at this and saying, we could raise interest rates, but it's not going to impact inflation. We have to wait until this transition to modern cars is over with. We have to wait until those lease rates, finally all of them sort of settle out, and that's going to take a couple of years. So our forecast for interest rates is that the Fed is going to lower interest rates a little bit later in the year. And the rationale for that is as the inflation rate comes down, slowly, but as it comes down, the real interest rate, which is the inflation-adjusted interest rate, would be going up, tightening credit conditions unless interest rates come down. But they don't have to come down by very much because, as you saw in the inflation diagram, inflation is not coming down very, very much. So we have about 75 basis points decline in interest rates. And then the Fed holds constant. Why do they hold constant and not continue to lower it as Wall Street thinks that they might? The answer is the economy is growing at trend, and we have full employment. The Fed has no reason to do that. In fact, by preserving interest rates where they are, they have a tool the next time we have a recession to counteract that recession. And by the way, we think of these as really high interest rates today, like mortgage interest rates, 6.5 to low 7s. Those are really normal interest rates. What's abnormal were these zero interest rates that we were experiencing. And we've had good economic growth with interest rates of that level. So let's look at interest-sensitive sectors and what was happening there and why so many economists got this wrong. And the first one I want to look at is housing. So housing is an important part of the business cycle. In fact, I have a colleague who wrote a paper that housing is the business cycle, right? And by housing, that's not real estate markets, that's the construction of new homes. And so what you see here is something that I've labeled the pandemic surge. During the pandemic, two things happened. One is we had a lot of migration, generating a need for a lot of new homes in places like Phoenix and Las Vegas. We also had people looking for larger homes, because if you didn't have a home office kind of sitting on your bed with a laptop open for 8 hours, not so cool, right? And so you wanted a larger place where you could work. And so that was a surge. That's an abnormal time. So let's go back to normal times. And 2018, 2019, and in the US, we were building 1.3 million new homes per year. That's below the average. The average is about 1.49. So it's below the historical average. And we've been underbuilding in the US for years, for many years, for decades, right? When we think about that in terms of California, we've underbuilt in California. Well, we've underbuilt kind of across the U.S. And then we have the pandemic surge, and the interest rates mortgage rates were at 4% then, and then we come up to today, and we're at 1.5 million per year, building more than we were building when mortgage rates were down at 4%. So why is that? Why didn't higher interest rates tank this market? There are a lot of people who have jobs. Remember that we're at full employment, who have money, who want to buy homes. But those of us who have 2.5 to 3% mortgage rates, we're not selling our homes to them. We don't want to go into a 7% mortgage rate. So the sale of existing homes has completely tanked. And you'll see that when we get to California. We have very low sales of existing homes. So if you have money and you're ready to buy a home, where are you going to buy that home? You're going to buy it in a development from a new home builder. So home builders' inventories are selling out at good prices, so they build more. Exactly the opposite of what you expect when interest rates go up. And so this is holding up the market. And then another interest-sensitive sector is automobiles. And we've been underbuilding autos. And we're probably too low on this forecast. But here's a capacity constraint, which is the ability of auto manufacturers to increase production. And so we have it, if you look at this diagram, this is historical over time. That's the Great Recession. That's the lockdown when we couldn't go to showrooms. It comes back to about normal. And then it drops because of chip shortage. Now we start to get back to normal. We have another dip because of the UAW strike, and we have it just being about average autos. And then the next one is durable goods. And durable goods is at record levels. And as evidence that we have capacity constraint is that the backlog for durable goods manufacturers has been growing. So orders are up, shipments are not, backlog is growing. That's going to carry us through without a downturn in manufacturing, even though we have these higher interest rates than we had recently. So all of these things are moving in opposite directions. But part of the good news as we look at 2024 and 2025 and into 2026 is that manufacturing capacity constraints are going to start easing. We are building factories all across the U.S., including here in California. And that's part of the new industrial policy. And so this is factory construction. And so you see it's kind of increasing, and then it takes off with the industrial policy. So that's a demand for construction today. It's a demand for manufacturing workers tomorrow. So all of these interest-sensitive sectors are contributing towards our economic growth, not towards a downturn, not towards a recession. And that's our return to normalcy. So let's look at other sectors. I want to look at tech, defense, and consumption. Consumption demand is 2/3 of GDP demand. So let's look at what we're doing as consumers. And this is, I just put a trend line in there. You notice that we're buying more today. We're above trend, and we're not coming back to trend, right? So we hear a lot about student debt, and for individuals, student debt is a real issue, but you can't find student debt restraining consumption here, right? You can't find consumer debt restraining consumption. What has happened, and what's important to recognize when you're looking at data, is that the pandemic fundamentally changed us. It changed the way we work, and it changed what we want to do. And one of the things that we want to do is not save as much for the future, but go out, enjoy ourselves, and spend today, and be with other people. And so our preferences have changed. We're no longer really willing to save as much to consume in 2028 or 2030 as we were pre-pandemic, because we're kind of more pessimistic about that far future. And anyway, the lockdown told us we really want to be with people. Just as a kind of a side note, experiential retail, brick and mortar retail, which was predicted to be a thing of the past, is flourishing today, because people want to go out, they want to be in stores, they want to be with other people. They're a little tired of just being online and buying things kind of anonymously. Even if they don't know the other people, they want to be around them. And I think if we look at, internally at ourselves, we know there's some real truth to that. So that's 2/3 of GDP. On top of this full employment economy, we have a more dangerous world. Defense budgets are going up, and that's for defense durable goods. That disproportionately affects California, because there's only a few places that this goes. And it's California, Texas, Georgia, a little bit to Arizona and Washington and Connecticut, right? So that's a disproportionate demand, and it's specifically, or is mostly in Southern California, but some in the Bay Area as well. And then tech. So this is tech payroll employment for the U.S. And if you squint, you still can't see the layoffs that you've heard about, right? Tech is growing. And we're going to look at California. It's a little bit different in California, but not that much different. So if you look at the increase in employment in tech over the last 12 months, it's 2.3%. It's not contracting in spite of the announcements of big layoffs. But when you think about those announcements, because so many tech companies are in California, these announcements are California companies who are saying we're going to be laying off 10,000 people. That's because of the WARN Act, right? They need to do that in advance just in case they're going to do that. But those companies are multinational companies. And the people who are being laid off are all over the globe, right? And these are the big mature companies, and they're not necessarily laying off all of those people. But if you look there at at the data, we have continued and record growth in tech. Okay, so to finish up the U.S., we have oil production and oil prices, and you see the orange is the West Texas intermediate price level, and it kind of bounces around, but the blue is U.S. oil production, and it keeps increasing. And the U.S. is now the largest producer of petroleum, extractor of petroleum from the ground in the world. And because of that, if Saudi Arabia decides they're going to reduce the amount of oil they sell in world markets, Texas and North Dakota oil companies, they just pump more. And so the market has really stabilized in the low 80s. So it's between about 78 and 82 dollars a barrel, and increases in the price of oil, of course, is going to affect the economy. What has happened, and kind of some of these spikes, one of the spikes that you see there is as a result of the sanctions against Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. But what has happened there is now Russia sells oil to China. China doesn't buy oil on the world market. Europe doesn't buy oil from Russia. It buys it on the world market. This is just moving the deck chairs around, right? It's not really changing the consumption of oil. It's just who is producing for whom. And so this is not going to be a real risk in our forecast. So the U.S. outlook, we have strong employment growth. We have income growth. We have investment and consumption keep driving this economy. And interest rate increases, they probably have kept the economy from being overheated, but they certainly didn't cause us to move into a recession. And we've got infrastructure, we have industrial policy, we have defense adding new demands over the next couple of years. So we actually have a fairly optimistic outlook, although this year, look for slow growth because we're running into capacity constraints of labor and factories and indeed in places like restaurants. And then finally, a recession is coming eventually, because it always does, but it's not in the data today. Okay, so let's turn to risks to the forecast. And there are many, and they're generally geopolitical. So Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, possible conflict, China, Taiwan, India, Pakistan. We also have election worries, and I mentioned that earlier, that as we get closer to the election, the closer the election is, the less confident we're going to be about what the post-election policies are going to be. And that's going to cause some restraint on the part of business in terms of their investment strategy. And then supply chain interruption. Climatological events, particularly in the manufacturing hubs in Asia, can really tank the supply chains, at least for some period of time. And as we saw the last time we had supply chain constraints, it adversely affects the economy. And when you think about, just now in Guangdong province in China, massive flooding. Bangkok, a major producer of goods for the U.S., sits less than 5 feet above sea level. So the major industrial centers in Asia can be subject to this. So something to keep our eyes on. Okay, turning to California, and I want to begin for California with this picture. Well, we have a couple of pictures here, which I think you'll recognize. LA, what it looks like today with snow on our mountains, and of course, Sea Ranch on the Sonoma coast. But I want to show you this National Review Special Edition, Leaving California. So I keep showing this picture because I love it. Notice the picture. It's clear who drew this picture did not know California, because all these people are supposedly leaving California, right, with their U-Hauls. Look where they're at. They're in Big Sur. They're not leaving California. They may be going to Morro Bay, but they're not leaving California. Well, but we do have to take seriously the fact that 500,000 people have left the state. So what's happening? Are we the new Rust Belt? That's kind of a really important question. And when you saw migration out of the Rust Belt, or today when you see migration out of Appalachia, out of West Virginia, those are economies that are declining, right? Businesses moving elsewhere, and you're getting a decline in GDP or a very anemic GDP. So what's been happening in California? Let's look at GDP. Well, there are two ways you can get more GDP. You can have more people, right? More people doing stuff gives you more stuff. which is why China is the second largest, has the second largest GDP in the world, but it's still a very poor country, right? Or you can be more productive. So I want to look at per capita GDP. Now, if we look at just GDP itself, California is one of the top states in GDP growth. But let's look at per capita. And so I have two graphs here. The first one goes from pre-pandemic to the end of 2023. And these are the large states, right? So the small states, we can pick on Delaware today. If Delaware were to grow at 10%, which would be amazing, you'd never see it in the US numbers. It's just too small. So these are the states that actually move the needle on GDP, and California is all the way over on the left, right? And then over the last year, 2023 quarter four to 2024 quarter four, it looks like Texas has moved ahead of California. That's, of course, because of the increase in oil production that I just showed you. So not an imploding economy at all. But we lost 500,000 people, and still we've got this kind of growth. So what is happening here is that we've got a churn in California. We've got a turnover in the population, and we're going to explore that a little bit. But one of the things that we always hear is that people are moving because of high housing costs. And that kind of makes sense. California's homes, well, actually what you're buying is the land, and you're buying the California lifestyle and the amenities and the weather and so on. It's always brought a premium, even back in the 60s and 70s when there was a lot of available land for building. And what happens when that premium becomes too high is that people move. And so we've seen that movement. But as they move, they bid up the price of homes where they're going. And so this is just a comparison between 2015 and today. And here is San Francisco, Miami. That premium has now dropped by 35%. And you see the others are sort of clustered in the 20 to 25%. And if you compare, say, Los Angeles and Austin, you don't get a housing bargain moving from LA to Austin, right? Or here where we are in Sacramento to Boise, there's no bargain in housing doing that. So that's slowing down, and we expect that to actually turn around. And if you looked at net migration between LA and Dallas, for years it's been almost zero because the premium's been in the right place, right? There are plenty of Angelenos who've moved to Dallas, to be sure. But there are also plenty of Texans who've moved from Dallas to Los Angeles. And so the net has been just about zero. So we're expecting that to slow down. Where we are with employment, so that's the big drop during the lockdown, 16%, but in March we're 1.8% above the previous peak. More employment than before. How do we get that with 500,000 Californians leaving? And kind of the anecdotal evidence, if any of you commute, if you go to the Bay Area and you drive through like the Altamont Pass, or if you do what I do is drive on a parking lot called the 405, you look around and you say, I thought you guys left for Texas. The employment in California is at record levels. So what's happened is people with larger families have moved out because they can afford the larger homes and kind of the lifestyle that they want. People with fewer skills and consequently command lower incomes, particularly if you have a large family, living in the coastal cities in California is going to be pretty tough. And so they've moved out, they've freed up housing units, and those who have moved in have been more highly educated, command higher salaries, and have smaller households. They have fewer, if any, children. And we notice this with this really sharp drop in elementary school enrollments throughout the state. That's the churn that's happening. And so there's kind of a social issue here, but that's what's happening in California. That's why we're getting superior economic growth, and yet we're losing people. And I guess this year we gained a few people, but not much. So looking at jobs, and I'm just going to quickly highlight. So there's finance, and that includes real estate brokers and mortgage brokers. Information, and information is where Hollywood lives. So you may not have known that Barbie was information, but Barbie is information and is in that last one. And Hollywood is restructuring now. It's shrinking, and so we've got negative growth there. But where we have positive growth is in healthcare and in tech and in construction and in durable goods manufacturing. So we want to take a look at these. But regionally, we've seen slow growth over this last year. And so this is maybe hard to see. The Sacramento and the Delta, the Central Coast, San Joaquin Valley, the North counties. So those are the ones that are up near the Oregon border. North Bay, all growing faster than the U.S. And Orange County and the Inland Empire, not that far behind. But you get over here, Los Angeles, Silicon Valley, and San Francisco. That's where weak job growth is. Those have turned around in the last 3 months, but over the last year, still weak job growth in those parts of the state. So let's take a look at manufacturing. And this is one of the reasons why, actually I should have said this on this. If you look here, most of those growing faster than the U.S. are places where people have moved to because they can do hybrid work. They can live further away from the cities. And that's where we're really seeing growth. But manufacturing, and we think about manufacturing as all left California, but in fact it's grown by 28%. That's output with fewer people. Part of the turn that's happening is the factories that are being built today are advanced manufacturing. And that advanced manufacturing requires fewer people, more highly skilled people, but fewer people. And that's growing, but where those factories are going in, that's in the inland parts of the state, and that's why the San Joaquin Valley was part of sort of the graph there that was to the left of the U.S. Turning now to logistics, which was a source of growth. So this is port traffic in the San Pedro Bay ports. So those are the largest ports in the Western Hemisphere and far larger than any other West Coast ports. This is exports, and it's kind of flat because the U.S. is doing much better than the rest of the world. The rest of the world, not so well. And so you don't get such an increase in demand. You don't get any increase in demand for U.S. goods. This is that pandemic surge, and now we're back to the same levels as before. And we're predicting growth in the demand for logistics labor for a couple of reasons. One is that this drop-off here was because of the threatened West Coast dock workers strike. Right? So it makes sense to send some of the cargo to East Coast ports. But now to get to East Coast ports, you have to go through the Panama Canal. And the Panama Canal is congested and has reduced capacity because the reason why the canal is where it is there's a big freshwater lake in the center of the canal, which saved on building costs. And because of climate change, that lake is now at much lower levels, and you can get fewer ships through there. And it costs for some of these ships $1 million a day to just sit there and wait. Right? So that traffic is starting to come back. Also, we're not the only ones that have labor negotiations at ports. Now it's time for the East Coast ports. So some of that is coming back. And then, unfortunately, going through the Suez Canal is more dangerous. So some of that comes back. So we're expecting a growth in logistics here in California and increased traffic through our ports. Now, turning back to tech, you can see a kind of a bump here. And then we get back to basically trend, but sort of flat. What's happened in the Bay Area, and that was those employment numbers that I showed you, what's happened in the Bay Area is that the big tech firms have laid off, and smaller firms are growing and are hiring, but that takes time. And that's one of the reasons why we have a higher unemployment rate in California than elsewhere, is that there are tech workers who are being hired, but they're taking their time to find the right job for themselves. But you notice it's not declining. And as soon as they're absorbed, we're expecting growth again. And part of the reason is this: it's AI. Everyone wants to be at the cutting edge of AI. No one wants to be left out. If you don't want to be left out of AI, there's only one place you can be, and that's the Bay Area, and San Francisco in particular. And you can just see that in this. This is KPMG's Venture Plus Q4 of 2023. These are the top 10 deals. And just quickly, San Francisco AI, Los Angeles AI, San Francisco Health Tech, Washington, D.C. gets one, San Francisco FinTech, Long Beach Aerospace, San Francisco Software, San Diego AI, San Francisco Healthcare, and New York. Right? So that's coming to California in a big way. Now, turning to housing, this is what I was talking about before. We're at depression levels of sales of existing single-family homes. But prices are now up. Our prices are increasing. No matter what price measure you look at, home prices in California are going up. We're not yet seeing a response to that in terms of building, but we're expecting a response. But we have a capacity constraint going on. So this is construction employment. I'm going to go start with the upper right hand, and that's non-residential, record levels, heavy and civil, and our infrastructure package is going to increase that. Record levels, specialty trade, similar. And residential, it's higher than any time except for the speculative building boom in the 2004 to 2006 period. We have a capacity constraint. We talk a lot about build, build, build to get out of our housing affordability situation. We don't have the workers to do it. So this is a growth area, but we can't double the amount of home production simply because we don't have the capacity. We're going to have to do it incrementally. That's what we built into our forecast. So Hollywood coming back slowly, but restructuring. That was in those earlier numbers. We have faster growth in logistics. We have defense and aerospace ramping up. Tech is the AI is the new darling of tech. We have construction growth and construction demand, but we have capacity constraints. We do have risks, and the risks are housing and homelessness, urban public safety, our drought and deluge, and an important one, if after the election China trade is shut down, that's going to adversely affect California. It's going to affect our logistics, and it's going to affect our manufacturing and our supply chain. So just a few numbers to finish up. We come back to normal growth in California, faster than the U.S., and constrained by the labor force, but 3.9% unemployment. And we're projecting fairly good growth in home building, in part due to the new laws that have been passed by the state legislature and signed by the governor. Those take about 3 years before you really start seeing the impact of that. So we're expecting that, but it remains to be seen. We've been high on our housing construction forecast for some time. So that brings me to the end, and I'd like to introduce my colleague, Ji-Yoon Lee, who is going to talk about what we're doing with climate change and trying to build that into our economic outlook. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jerry, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here. So, as you know, climate change has become an important issue in California, and it's affecting the economy. So, our research team at UCLA Anderson Forecast has been working on integrating climate change impacts into our forecast model. So today, I'm going to walk you through some of our ongoing work and let you know our future direction. Here's a roadmap. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the goals of our work. and then inputs, model, and I'll show you some preliminary results on disaster modeling, specifically on wildfires. And finally, I'll conclude and talk about our future work. So the ultimate goal of our work is to develop statewide and regional economic forecast accounting for climate change impacts over the next couple of decades for California. So our model is going to take climate data and economic data to make forecast. As you know, climate change or changing climate or increase in temperature can lead to more frequent natural disasters. So we're going to focus on disaster impact as well as temperature impacts. So we'll have a granular model of wildfires and a granular model of sea level rise in our future work. So in the long term, people adapt to climate change. So they learn from their past climate experience and they take actions to adapt. Also, government implement some climate mitigation policies to mitigate climate impacts. So we're also considering accounting for these kind of impacts and build them into our forecast model. So we have dedicated a lot of time and effort bringing together data that is dispersed across the University of California system. So UCLA Anderson Forecast is going to be our main economic data resource. We also collect climate data with fine spatial resolution from outside resources, such as government agencies and climate research groups. So we're going to aggregate all these kind of resources into our climate forecast model. So next, I'm going to talk about how we augment our California economic model with our climate impact modeling. So there are two approaches. The first approach is temperature modeling. This is a more general approach because it indirectly models climate change impact through temperature. There are two parts. The first part is that we collect the climate data and we also collect economic data. Then we establish the linkage between climate and economy. The second part is geospatial climate modeling. This is very complicated, and we're going to take inputs from climate scientists about future climate scenarios. So the temperature modeling allows us to output forecast estimate for future economic forecasts under different climate scenarios. Our second approach is direct modeling of economic impacts of specific disasters, such as wildfires, flooding, and extreme heat. So this is, it will be a nice complement of our temperature modeling. So I'll be focused on disaster modeling because temperature modeling requires a lot of time and efforts, so its output is in development. So we collect disaster declaration data of all the counties in California from FEMA, and we look at disasters that are specific to California. So what we are looking at in this chart are the number of disaster declarations of all the counties in California across time. So the red lines are wildfires, and they're crucial throughout. The blue lines are floodings, and they become more important in the past 5 years. And there are also other natural disasters, but they're not as frequent as wildfires and flooding. For example, hurricane only happened in 2005. So we're going to mainly focus on wildfire impact modeling and flood impact modeling. Next, I'll go into some details about our modeling of wildfire impacts in California. So here's a little bit background. Because of climate change, there are many studies showing that wildfire annual burn areas are increasing. And also wildfires can generate huge amounts of air pollution that can travel long distance to places without wildfires. So studies show that average annual PM 2.5 due to wildfires has also been increasing. So PM 2.5 is a measurement of air pollution. It's a small particle that can get into your lung and affect human health. And they have economic impacts. So for example, they can influence economic activities, such as cause physical damage to nearby infrastructure and temporal disruptions to business and influence insurance. And air pollution due to wildfires can also negatively influence human health and reduce worker productivity. In addition, it can also increase government expenditure to help the economy recover from the disaster. So to model these kind of economic impacts, our research team constructed two kind of wildfire exposure measures. Our first measure is gonna be land-based. So we calculate population that are exposed to burned areas for each county and a year. The second measure is more air pollution based. So we calculate wildfire-related PM 2.5 in each county and in each year. So here is a visualization of the data we're using to construct our first measure, which is population that are exposed to wildfire burned areas in each county. So we collect historical burned area data from 1921 to 2020. So from the upper left to the lower right are maps of burned area in California over time. So I would like to point out that most significant wildfires mostly happened in mountain areas, but they do not exclusively happen in mountain areas. And there's an increasing trend of burned areas, especially during the past 2 decades. And in the last decade, there were a lot of wildfires happening in Northern California. Here's another visualization of our second measure that we used to construct our air pollution-based wildfire exposure. So we collect historical wildfire attributed PM 2.5 data from 2006 to 2020. So unlike land-based measure, air pollution can also travel to places that are distant from wildfires. So in 2020, you can see that air pollution due to wildfires are all over the place in California. So that's why we construct the air pollution-based measure to model this air pollution impact. So next, I'll show you some preliminary results. So we use these two kind of wildfire exposure measures, and we link them with economic data to establish the linkage between wildfire exposure and county-level California economic performance. So we find that exposure to wildfire burned area and exposure to wildfire-related PM 2.5 can significantly reduce economic performance. Specifically, if a county is exposed to an additional percentage change in wildfire attributed PM 2.5, county level GDP is gonna be down by 9.9%, and employment is reduced by 1.6%, and annual personal earnings is gonna be reduced by 1.9%. So additional percentage change in population exposed to a wildfire burned area, county level GDP will be reduced by 1.1%, and annual employment will be reduced by 2.6%, and annual personal earnings will be reduced by 3.6%. So after we establish this linkage between wildfire exposure and economic performance, our next step is we are going to collaborate with climate scientists on future wildfire scenarios. And then we're going to do a back-of-envelope approach. So we're going to forecast the future wildfire impacts on the economy. So in our next project, we'll also be use the same approach as wildfire modeling to model the flooding impacts. So because of climate change, the frequency of flooding and water-related damages in California are also increasing. So we also collect flooding declaration data from FEMA, and we calculate number of days that each county reports flooding. So here's a visualization of how the flooding reports change over time in California. So during the period from 1961 to 1981, there are only a few counties that reported flooding. However, during the past 2 decades, from 2003 to 2023, most of the counties in California have reported more than 8 times. Have reported flooding for more than 8 times for a year. So there's an increasing trend of flooding, and it's important to also model this kind of disaster impacts. And takeaway and future work. So because of climate change, disasters have become more frequent and severe in California. And we have been working on linking the climate data and economic data to establish the linkage between between disaster exposure and economic performance. And we found that exposure to climate disasters can reduce economic performance significantly. So next year, we are going to show you full results for the temperature modeling and flooding impacts on the economy. Thank you.
Did we answer all your questions?
If you don't mind, I'm just really sorry. That's no problem.
Sure. While you're coming up, let me point out that the state of California has generously supported the work that GUN has been doing, and we have much more to do, but I think it's really pushed us ahead of the game relative to other states in terms of having detailed data on how climate change is going to affect our economy for better policy making. Yes. Sorry to those on Zoom.
Yeah, is this on? Yeah. Yeah, just very simply, when you went through the list of disasters, it seemed they were immediate disasters: wildfire that burns and then burns out, a flood that occurs and then abates. But are there long-term disasters as a result of climate change that also factor in to your forecast? And the one I think of most is drought, which is temperature related.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I will show you this. So we are doing we have two approaches for our modeling. The first approach is temperature modeling, and it's very complicated because the second step of temperature modeling is like we have to collaborate with climate scientists on future climate scenario, like what drought look like in next 10 decades or 20 decades. And they have very complicated climate modeling. So we're going to take inputs from the climate scientists and plug that number into our damage function to forecast. So its output is still in development. And so we also have a second approach, which is disaster modeling. This is a direct modeling of economic impacts of specific disasters. So these two kind of approaches we are using. So they complement each other.
Okay, so if you're talking about drought, like extreme heat
yeah, is our first approach.
That's what the peg was for.
Yes.
Right, and you know, one of the issues and why it is taking us the length of time and the amount of time that it is that, you know, as we look at the long term, which was your question, you know, we're talking about things that have never happened, right? So we have to infer from what has happened on the data that we have, and we want to do that carefully so that we're not just speculating, but we have kind of an informed economic impact. And do we have other questions?
So I'm very interested in what your work can tell us about the cost-benefit analyses of various kinds of interventions. We have folks all over the UC system that are working on mitigation of climate change. For example, on the Santa Cruz campus, we have researchers who are working on building coastal protection that is intended to reduce the impact of flooding, at least on the coastal regions, by building up natural plants and so on that can protect the coast from flooding. Also, there's regulatory possibilities that have to do with the ways in which residential growth is reaching out into peripheral areas, out into forested areas, increasing the likelihood of impacts from wildfires because those areas are cheaper. And because as housing costs increase in the coastal regions of California, you've got people pushing further and further out into the forests. So I'm wondering both on the regulatory side and basically just cost benefit, because what you're telling us is this is going to be very costly. So then the question for legislators and for policymakers is, does that help justify investment in mitigating strategies, and how much investment would make a difference in slowing down those economic disastrous impacts?
Right. This is a perfect question because it's exactly what we're doing. So the modeling that is going on is to basically say, here's the economic impact if we do nothing, and year by year, right? And then once we have that in place, because the climate part comes from others, right? And so once that's in place, then we can take the research that comes from all over the University of California system, as well as elsewhere, on things like the buildup of marshlands and wetlands in the Bay Area, and say, if this mitigation happens, then that's equivalent to X. And you know, now the engineers will give the legislature the cost. But we'll see that as it unfolds over the years, so that it's not in 2040 this is going to happen, but rather if you do something in the next 5 years, here's the benefit, or if you do it the 5 years after, or, you know, and that's the kind of scenario analysis that I think will inform policymakers as well. There, you know, you spoke about California population moving out into other areas that are maybe more disaster prone. Of course, is the insurance issue, but there are also wildfire mitigation things that can happen. I mean, there was a wildfire in Orange County, and a community had been built with mitigation in mind, and you know, kind of the fire went around it. So those are the kinds of things that we will be able to build in once we finish building out this modeling, and be able to say, you know, here's one, here's if you mitigate, and here's if you mitigate at different points in time. And now policymakers, you know, it's up to you to take this analysis and make the decision as to what you would like to do.
I think that's going to be incredibly helpful. And of course, it'll be very interesting for economists to look at the interventions of the insurance industry, who will reshape this landscape faster than any policymaker can, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Folks, we're all out of time for questions, but we're actually going to move on to some closing remarks from Provost Newman.
Thank you so much to both of our economist colleagues for enlightening us about what the present holds as well as what the future holds. And also to all of you for joining us this morning. Immediately following this enriched conversation, we're going to have a series of panel discussions where you're going to hear from California's top leaders about the challenges that are facing the state, but also hear about some of the innovative solutions and collaborations that are going to help the state navigate even through the most turbulent times. This will underscore something that we believe in this center, which is the power of collaboration, the power of innovation, and the kind of forward-thinking sustainability strategies that have gripped the University of California and which the state legislature has been remarkably generous in funding. All of the work that's been done on climate mitigation has been supported by the state, and I think you're going to see the payoff as we move closer to those return on investment models. We'll know more what to invest in, and we'll know more about the likely impacts. So the next conversation is going to start in about 12 minutes at 10:30, followed by panels at noon, at 1:30, and at 3 o'clock. And please join us for as much of that conversation as you possibly can.